Hello and welcome back to our last module for Philosophy and Humor, Phil 1013. This isn't a content module as much as it is a final exam review. So I will go sort of briefly through the material and kind of give you the structure of the final exam. And then we'll meet again one last time this coming Monday, and there I can take specific questions. So first of all, a couple of you have already done it, so that's very good. It's, I guess, a sign that you're comfortable with the material. But those of you that haven't, that's perfectly fine, because it is actually open from the 12th, has been since the 12th, right to the 25th of April. So lots of time. Okay, so what I want to do is, first of all, just give you the outline of the test. It's in 4 parts. It looks exactly the same as the one that you wrote halfway through the term for the midterm. There are 2 sort of choice sections and then 2 other sections that you have to answer. So the first and the third, which are the true, false, and the short answer questions, those you have to answer all of them. So the true, false, there's 10 statements that are hopefully pretty straightforward. And like I stressed before, pay attention to the actual, like the secondary clause. If it says, according to Plato, comma, we should do the following. Don't worry about who said it as much as, what did this person say? Does this make sense relative to what we talked about? That, according to Plato, superiority theory has to do with the fact that we feel like just wee little creatures and, we just don't have any control on our lives, etc. No. It's quite the opposite. So see what I mean? Don't worry so much about the person. Worry more about what that person said or says, and you'll probably have a much better opportunity to answer it correctly. So that's true, false. The third part, the other sort of where there's no choice, no options, there are 5 questions there that are short answers, which by that I mean literally 3 sentences can answer it. These are, again, covering only the second half of the term. The entire test is on only the second half of the term. So here, 5 reasonably short questions that you can answer in 2 to 3 sentences. Each one is worth 3 marks, so it'll be a total of 15. True, false is 10. Now the second, identify and explain, and the fourth, which is a longer answer question, those you've got a little bit of choice. So the second one, identify and explain, very much like the one that you wrote in the midterm. And there, I wrote them down. There was a whole bunch of different things. 2 types of ethnic humor, stupid and canny, racism, sexism, various different types of laughter, transcendental, satanic, golden, the idea of hypocrisy, negative stereotypes, coping humor, dumb blonde jokes, some ideas related to postmodernism. It's kind of all over the place. So you only have to answer 5. So that section is only out of 10. So 2 sentences. What is it? And then identify it or use it, or identify perhaps someone who said it, where we kind of experience it. If we're talking about subversive humor, likely we're going to talk about the postmodern condition, right? Rather than say, humor and religion. So again, couple of sentences, and that will answer it more than sufficiently. Okay, so, and then the last question, it's a single question, but I think it's broad enough that you can sort of sit down and think about it rather than sort of chase through your notes and looking at all kinds of, other sources. It's a general question about postmodernism. So I'll say that much. So the last question is about the postmodern condition that we talk about. In fact, we spend essentially the last 4 weeks on postmodernism. So think about what it is. Try to identify it, at least the way that we have in the course. And the question will pertain to something in particular. So it's a kind of a general knowledge question about postmodernism, but general knowledge relative to the issue of humor. So that's as much as I want to say. Now remember, we looked at a whole bunch of books here. This is the comedy book, one of the ones that I used. This is the source of the very last section, the last module, Humor, Noel Carroll. This was the main text that we used, which is Philosophy of Humor. And then I also used these 2. This was Comedy, Tragedy, and Religion, very good book by Jean Morial, and Philosophy of Laughter and Humor. It's another one here. So all these books we used in this course. I know it sounds like a lot, but I've digested them for you. I read through them, digested them, and summarized them. So they're all there in the modules. Another strategy I can certainly point out is, as you noticed in the video lectures, after not module 8, because we started, but module 9 all the way through to the end, there's a short module summary of the previous week at the beginning of each of the modules, starting with module 9. So 9 through 13, you will have a whole bunch. It's a total of 3 slides. Those 3 slides, really, if you can look at those and just kind of read through them, that gives you a lot of information for you to consider and think about. Now, whether you want to write it down or you just sort of look at it and just think about it, that's really the best source. So yes, of course, you can rewatch the video lectures or whatever else, but if you want to be really strategic about it, and there's nothing wrong with that, take a look at the first 3 slides of the modules 9 through 13. That will give you just about everything you need for the second half of this course, which is the source of this second exam. So generally speaking, and of course, here's how I do it. I'll yellowed out sections here. Module 8, we talked about humor and ethics. We talked about this notion that laughter is humorous exaggeration. Reality is distorted, the comic effect. And while we're doing this, we're kind of thinking outside the box, right? Because to think humorously is to think creatively and critically. Humor itself has a means of solidifying people. It provides solidarity, and it's called coping humor. Coping humor is really good for individuals who have a common enemy, right? And that common enemy we can laugh at because all of us together face the same obstacle, right? The same, sore point, we'll say. So coping humor is the way in which humor identifies and solidifies a group of people. Now, of course, when you do that, it also divides. And this is something that becomes more serious in the very last module that we looked, module 13, because it can be a coping mechanism, but it can be a divisive mechanism as well. So keep that in mind. So it is a kind of social solidarity and bonding, but it can also be socially divisive. It depends on who the other group is. When we talk about us and them, right, the us, which is our, of course, right-thinking, wonderful, good-natured group versus them. Depending on who them is, right, there's some grammar for you, on who them is, you can either be coping or you can be racist and sexist. So think about the content of that other group that you identify yourself against. Okay. Jokes also are not the context in which we expect truth. They are not truth statements. They are simply fiction. Jokes like this depend on us adopting a certain attitude, right? Those shared presuppositions and attitude endorsements. So humor and ethics and the very last module really kind of mirror each other. We start and we end with very many of the same ideas, right? This us and them idea. The fact that jokes aren't where we tell the truth. We may trade in truths, but they are not the truth, right? Because what is humor? It's an exaggeration, right? It's an exaggeration of truth. So where things really get dicey and problematic is when you start dealing with stereotypes. And when you get into stereotypes, you're dealing with racism and sexism. And that's where you want to stop, because that's no longer funny. We talked about humor and religion. Tragedy and comedy at one point had that same source, which was these religious festivals that probably have not been around for, let's say, about 500 years. But they really kind of, they were diluted and diffused over the last 1,500 years. But here we were talking about ancient Athens and some of the ancient festivals that they had, the Dionysian festivals, for example, where they would celebrate Dionysus, who was the god of grape, of harvest, madness, fertility. Covers it all, right, doesn't he? Okay. Both tragedy and comedy provided this unique perspective on the world. And that's why it coexisted. It was still talking about the same world, but it viewed that same world very, very differently. So we have this kind of, tragic hero that is stiff, unyielding, idealistic, it's my way or the highway, etc., etc. And then the comic hero, right? That's fast and loose and flexible, who's got a plan B, who's, mentally agile and, well, if this doesn't work, maybe I'll try this, and then can think on their feet. So that's where these ideas start, right? Is these two worldviews that come out of the same festivals, ironically enough. So we talked about the fact that religion looks for meaning, predictability, security, stability, and humor really does the opposite, right? It wants to shake things up, it wants to get people laughing. So it deals with absurdities, incongruities, ambiguities. These things are really the part, the bread and butter of humor, which is really the opposite of religion. We talked about, for example, the benign smile, right? Not this past week, the week before, we talked about the notion of the smile and laughter. And it takes many, many years before the church even acknowledges that smiling is not evil. Smiling is a nice feeling. And whether it is accompanied with laughter, it's secondary. But the smile was a good thing, right? It was a benign gift that is given to us. We talked about the holy fool. The holy fool being this character that is able to allow us to see the otherness of the world, the otherness of reality, the metaphysical side, right, the religious side. And really the holy fool is there to indicate to us that the material world will eventually die away, and we will die away too. So why not kind of latch on to things that will last an eternity, an infinity, right, which is love and religious thoughts and a belief in God. So the holy fool, as much as they are acting foolishly in our world, are a kind of conduit into this other world, into this metaphysical realm of theological thought and religious thought and heaven and things like that. So that's what the holy fool does. It identifies these kind of human failings and frailties that we have, because after all, we are easily distracted. We like shiny things, but the holy fool says, yeah, but there's more to life than just that. That's essentially what the holy fool does. We talked a little bit about Jewish humor, being very good at understanding the world as being incomprehensible, sometimes not yielding up meaning. And so the Jewish faith deals with these kinds of ideas really well, because there is no final word when it comes to either what the Pope says, since they don't have one, or the idea that the world sometimes doesn't give up its meaning very easily. So we kind of have to struggle for it. So if you can laugh at those struggles periodically, you're probably doing okay. Now we finally talked about Hinduism and Buddhism. These two forms of religion have a lot in common with humor, because they deal with emotional detachment, mental flexibility. Those that practice this religion try to free themselves from the world, free themselves from their ego, whether it's achieving nirvana or meditation or some sort of transcendental meditation in particular, anything to remove themselves from the material world and achieve that inner peace. Well, humor does the same sort of thing, right? It uses the same mechanisms, that emotional detachment, mental flexibility, detaching from the world. Because remember, I think I said it right early on, jokes aren't meant to be invested with emotional impact or emotional importance. We might have a joke where somebody jumps out of an airplane, facing certain death. Well, we don't worry about them, because that's not what a joke does, right? It removes us from reality and just sort of presents a scenario that's meant to be funny, not something that we should be considered or concerned with. Okay, modules 10 through 13, we looked at postmodernism. So I'm going to try to give you the highlights here. Okay, the first thing is trying to identify what postmodernism is. Well, it is a worldview that deals with playfulness, self-consciousness, it's very self-referential, it's ironic, it doesn't take itself seriously, it tries to bring high and low things together, whether it's high and lowbrow culture or high and lowbrow ideas. And so it brings these two things together and creates something new. So there's no such thing in a postmodern world as high and low culture. Now, Individuals think of the postmodern condition in certain ways. Jean Baudelaire talks about this image-dominated world. We are saturated with images from advertising, billboards, and everything else, to the point where we really deal with each other as if we were images. We deal with reality not as reality that is immediate, but instead mediated by imagery. Jean-François Lyotard talks about a skepticism towards meta-narratives, which is this disbelief in any kind of authority figure that says, it's my way, I've got the answer, follow me. Anybody that says that, we should be skeptical, right? We should be very careful to put our, all of our eggs in one basket, as we are prone to saying, and believing in this one single person. We should be skeptical. There is certainly the attack on authority figures, the ability of humor to subvert authority figures through satire and parody. That's very much a postmodern thing. Now, satire has been around forever. In fact, since the ancient Greeks. And that's one of the reasons why Plato hated humor, because he didn't like being made fun of. And he and Socrates and Aristotle and the rest of the philosophers at that time were ripe for humor and ripe for comedy because they thought of themselves so seriously. The more seriously you think of yourself as an authority, the bigger of a target you become for humor. So kind of look at it that way. So postmodernism and humor, they're destructive, subversive, they're negative. They're more concerned with the process than the final product. They embrace plurality, language games, playfulness, creativity, inclusivity as well. All these things kind of make up that postmodern condition, we'll call it. So playfulness and creativity work together, but they also can apply to thinking processes, right? Thinking about the world in a playful and creative way, to kind of not settle for the status quo, not to settle for, the first thing that comes along or the easiest thing that comes along. So that was the first part. The second part of humor and postmodernism, we talked about unworlding, for example. We were talking about comic fiction and how certain aspects of comic fiction, such as the work of Thomas Pynchon, is able to create and allow to coexist the natural and the supernatural world. Over the last, let's say, 300 to 400 years, depending where you want to pin it down, science has been very successful, and utilitarianism have been very successful in pushing aside religion. Pushing it aside is not the foundation of society anymore, but those two, science and utility, being the focus of society, the way things ought to be. And so Pynchon says, look, comic fiction allows us to reintroduce these supernatural or religious ideas in a kind of comedic way, in a questioning kind of way, a parodic kind of way, satirical as well. But we're still talking and thinking, aren't we? Right? We're still talking and thinking about these terms. And so when we're doing that, we are unworlding. We're taking two worlds and allowing them to coexist very nicely. They're not in contradiction with one another. They interpenetrate one another. They overlap one another. And so that's a kind of postmodern view of the role of religious thought and the role of spirituality in the everyday. So that's the idea of unworlding. That would be a definition, as it were. Now, we talked about the similarities between stand-up humor and philosophy. They use imaginary characters. They question everyday life. They use detachment and impartial reflection. Remember, we don't want an emotional investment. We just want to think about these characters. Shifts in perspective. And the ever popular what if, what if this happened? What if that happened? What if animals talked? What if kids ran the country, et cetera, et cetera. And the most important one is critically challenging authority. That's what both philosophy and humor do. That's what they have in common. So those 5 or 6 things, I think, are very much what is common ground between philosophy and stand-up humor. Imaginary creatures, questioning everyday experience, detachment and impartial reflection, shifts in perspective, the what if, problematic, and questioning and challenging authority. Those are the 6 things. Now, within all of that, we've talked about a couple of humorists, Lenny Bruce, for example, and Bill Hicks, going after the hypocrisy in the modern world and modern society, the hypocrisy of otherwise religious individuals doing things that are just really bordering on evil and unethical behavior. That's hypocrisy. We also talked about, too, the fact that stand-up comedians, no matter what they say, because we're not expecting the truth here, but if it offends people, stand-up comedians always have that default position of, I was only joking, right? It's just a joke. I was only joking. Now, we have to think about that. It's true. They were. What they're saying is not considered to be the truth. It is simply an exaggeration, a sort of like kind of playful twisting of the truth. So yes, they were only joking. But as we saw in our last set of modules, it still matters who's saying it. So parodic humor, satirical humor, post-structuralist feminist humor, Hélène Cixous that we talked about, the use of feminine writing or écriture féminine, that's the French term for it, a kind of parodic writing where women philosophers, because Cixous is a philosopher as well, writing in this kind of parodic way and questioning the authority of these philosophical figures, questioning the authority of Hegel and Plato and Aristotle and Nietzsche and the rest of these folks. Although I have to tell you, as much as Nietzsche didn't appear to be a big fan of women, there are several feminist philosophers that really like Nietzsche because he is so provocative, that he is so difficult to pin down. They like that sort of Mercury-like qualities about his work. So they don't always go after every single philosopher. There may be certain aspects of certain philosophers that they like, and they want to exploit that. So Cixous talks about language in particular as being the representation of patriarchy. And patriarchy is like the structure of society in every sense of the word, because it has to do with gender roles. It has to do with the way language articulates certain ideas, the way in which we view the world in terms of a sense of plenitude or absence. We talked briefly about how Freud sort of defined sexuality as having something or lacking something, rather than saying these are two different, kinds of genitalia, for example. But when you say one is absent and because it's missing something, that's a value judgment. So that's what these very sharp and perceptive feminine writers or feminist writers do, is they point out these blind spots and go, wait a minute. Okay, this definition is ridiculous. You're saying that my definition is because of I lack something? Are you serious? That's a satire. That's the parody. So that's what feminist writing does. Now, the very last module that we looked at was humor at the limits of meaning, where I want to sort of go through that carefully. Here we sort of talked about two different things. The first one was this idea that laughter represents the limits of meaning, right? How far we can go to understand the world. And Jean-Luc Nancy, another French philosopher, came up with this idea of transcendental laughter. This idea that we just kind of shrug our shoulders and go, that's it. That's as far as we can go. And it has to do with the way in which language is metaphoric. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that language, words specifically, stand in for things. So when we are trying to describe something, we are using words that are never anchored in any true sense to the thing that they define. If I say a red ball, okay, the ball is a round thing. Yeah, but there's all kinds of other things that are round. A pumpkin is round, a soccer ball is round, the earth is round. Okay, I get it. Okay, I'm talking about a red ball. Well, yeah, but a tomato is red, a fire hydrant is red, Okay, I get it. So hopefully, bad example, I know, but the idea that the words that we just use to describe something and try to be as specific as possible actually can describe so many other things that we end up sometimes unable to describe something in any really significant way, other than holding the thing up and showing it to somebody and go, here, this. Okay, that's where we start. But language is very slippery. Language seems to never give us that final meaning, that final sense of authority, because all language is an endless stream of words. And what Nancy does is he says, look, at the end, we just shrug our shoulders and go, okay, that's the best I can do to describe something. So does it cause us panic and anxiety? No, we just simply laugh and we shrug our shoulders. Now, Charles Baudelaire, another Frenchman from the 1860s, kind of gave us a new definition of superiority theory. And he said, no, we should be calling it inferiority because we are not superior. We're in fact satanic. When we're laughing at other people, we are being satanic. And what he means by that is we are trying to assert superiority over other people, over, the animal world, the natural kingdom, our mortality. How dare we, right? How dare we think that we are superior creatures in any sense of the word simply because we can say so. So he calls it satanic laughter because the worst kind is the kind of humor that we originally started with, which was superiority, right? For Baudelaire, that is satanic because we are not superior creatures. We are lowly, not lonely, but lowly inferior creatures, and we have no right to speak in those terms, and least of all to make fun of others in this way, because it borders on pride, right? It borders on hubris. We haven't earned that. For Baudelaire, we haven't earned that because we are, hypocritical, lowly individuals, who fear our mortality. So that's Baudelaire. Nietzsche comes up with his idea. So we have satanic laughter, transcendental laughter, and now we have golden laughter. And golden laughter is Nietzsche's idea that we are, no matter what, even if we are like Sisyphus, rolling up a boulder to the top of the mountain, only to have it roll down to the bottom. Oh my God. Nietzsche goes, you know what? At least you're still alive. At least you're still alive. If all you do is roll that damn ball or, boulder up the hill, at least you're alive. So that golden laughter is very similar to what Bergson talked about, that élan vital, right? That vital force. So that vital force, which is us, our creativity, our desire, our ability to be happy, our ability to be creative, that's what Nietzsche calls golden laughter. This idea that, it's an identifier of us as human beings. As yes, mortal creatures who, struggle and have obstacles, but we're still alive. We are the ones who decide what to fight for and what to fight against. So golden laughter has to do with that creative force that we have that simply allows us to stop and laugh at the obstacles that are worth laughing at, but identifying the more serious ones. So it's kind of a little bit like the Buddhism, don't sweat the small stuff. Nietzsche says, don't sweat the small stuff. There are other things that are more serious, that are worthy of our attention. The rest of it, just laugh it off. So for him, that's a kind of golden laughter because it is who we are, right? It is something that we do. Now, the last two people we looked at in Module 12, Simon Critchley and Helmut Plessner. Critchley really kind of thinks along the same way as Nietzsche, this idea that laughter is an affirmation of our humanity, the limits of our understanding, acknowledgement that, we and the world and our mortality is limiting. And it's what we do. It's what we do with the world, right? Do we worry about every last little obstacle or do we pick and choose? Do we pick and choose our battles? Right? We should do that. And some of these things we should just laugh off, right? Because we can. Now, that's true. Chaos is never far away, but we need to at least address the obstacles and struggles that are worthy of being called that versus something that it really in the big picture isn't that important. So Critchley, like Nietzsche, thinks about laughter as an identifier of who we are as human beings, that we have limitations. But even within those limitations, we can live our lives to the fullest extent that we can. Plessner talked about the notion of laughter and smiling, the notion that when we are laughing and smiling, the distinction typically between the mind and the body kind of collapse. And we now can see what the mind is thinking. And he extends it as well to crying. Crying is when the body and the mind collapse into one entity, one unit. Because when someone is sobbing, weeping, crying, we know exactly what's going on. We don't have to ask them like, are you sad? Well, of course they are, right? They're crying, they're weeping, they're sobbing about something. So Plessner says there are certain times, in our lives where that collapse is absolutely 100%. And our expressions are very much, identifying what's on our mind. So that was number 12, and this is the last one here, the second part of Humor at the Limits of Understanding. And here's where we kind of get to the crux of the matter, and very much in the postmodern world, the notion that humor plays with the norms that govern society and culture, and humor alerts us, right? It identifies what these norms are, often for some people for the first time. Certain things are done in a certain way, and the laughter is derived from what some people don't know, or they are unaware that things are done a certain way. So they could be the object of humor, and of course, these are things that can be corrected. So humor does play with social norms and expectations, because if it's not there, then we don't have something to compare to in our minds when we compare what is going on with what should be going on. And so this is the norms of society and culture that form the kind of background upon which or against which the joke is being said. Now, humor also maintains or constructs and maintains this idea of an us and them. And this goes back to humor and ethics, that coping humor can be a good thing. We can certainly identify a common enemy, whether that enemy is, governmental, political, actual enemy. It could be your boss. Let's say 4 or 5 of you work somewhere and you've got this boss that just kind of isn't the nicest person in the world. So you kind of make jokes about them. So that's called coping humor, right? It allows you to deal with the fact that this boss is not the best, nicest person in the world. But it also is divisive, because when we create an us and them, the us, which is ourselves, we are the better of the two, and them could be anyone. It could be someone that, again, on the one hand, a common enemy, but here's where it starts getting kind of unethical or amoral, when the them becomes an identifiable group of people, whether they are people of color or of a certain, race, nationality, religious or affiliation, a certain hair color, a certain sex. When you think of racism and sexism, the them is clearly identifiable. And these may be things that these people cannot change. If you're making a joke about the color of someone's skin, that's as low as you can get, because that's clearly something they cannot change. So if you're making jokes that are pedagogical, right, educational, these are jokes about things that people can change, then yes, you can do that, depending on the setting. And the person may or may not pay attention to you, but it is something they can change. But making jokes and at the expense of the color of someone's skin, or the color of their hair, or whatever, these are things that are a lot more difficult to change. The color of someone's skin in particular, right? Yes, now we can, a person can change their sex, yes. But when you're making jokes about the fact that fully half of the population is not male, that's not humor. That's something else. So the us and them, we've got to be really careful. And the statement I must have said half a dozen times, I'm going to say it again. It matters who is telling the joke, in what context, and for what reason. So yes, there could be some jokes that on the surface appear racist or sexist, but they could also be really clever wordplays. They could be really kind of funny because it's a trick of the tail. It's some kind of, subverting of the meaning of a word. So it isn't just necessarily racist or sexist. It's doing something else. So no matter what, these kinds of jokes still ask us to endorse a certain attitude. They're asking us to endorse a racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever attitude against another group of people. Now, does this mean that we are going to carry on like this for the rest of our lives? No. The joke is asking us to temporarily adopt a certain point of view for the joke to be A, funny, and B, have some kind of meaning. But once a joke is over, then it disappears. It literally dissipates. It disappears into the ether, and we carry on. So the arguments and ideas that we're presenting, right, this attitude endorsement, ultimately, we shouldn't be too critical of it, because these ideas are simply versions of the truth. But when we're dealing with, with stereotypes and caricatures of people at their expense, that's when things are going very, very wrong. So When we're doing this kind of thing, we're reinforcing social structures that are already unjust and discriminatory. So when the joke plays with this and it trades in discrimination, it better be really clever before somebody can say, yeah, that's really funny. Sounds like a racist or sexist joke, but yeah, there's something else going on. So be careful when you are trading this kind of humor that perpetuates an unjust political system or economic or social system. All these things simply reinforce what is already there. Good humor should always punch up, not punch down. So when we get humor, and we've talked about using either the N-word or reverse racism and things like that, that's a sign of people punching up, right? Taking and using humor as a vehicle to get us to rethink a certain idea. When that happens, that humor is useful. It's pedagogical. It's educational. But if it perpetuates these stereotypes, no, that's not humor anymore. Okay, so that's pretty well it. That's the whole course, or the second half, of the course. We'll meet again on Monday. And here, if you have any specific questions, I can't give you the answers, of course, but if you have specific questions about the exam or clarification, please do show up on Monday, and we're going to try to get all that sorted out. In the meantime, have a good weekend. It's still pretty nice. It hasn't started raining yet. It's about 2 o'clock. But yes, enjoy the weekend, and we'll see each other on Monday. Take care.